Anselm Kiefer. Anselm Kiefer's transformation of an abandoned silk factory at La Rebote, located near the town of Bariac in France, into a monumental work of contemporary art is perhaps the summa of his entire career as an artist. As chronicled by Sophie Fiennes in her excellent documentary entitled Over Your City's Grass Will Grow, we see Kiefer at work constructing his monumental opus out of the ruins of 47 buildings strewn with paintings, broken pottery vessels, fallen meteorites, stacks of sculptured books, layers of shattered glass, and a haunting series of enigmatic pillars built out of concrete slabs stacked with precarious incertitude atop sculptures of books with splayed open pages, spines broken, and contents ruptured like innards exposed to the heavens. As we watch Kiefer apply a blowtorch to melt liquid metal in a cauldron, which he then spills out across a dirt mound, or throw panes of glass which shatter across the floor of an installation composed of burnt-out, ashy-looking books, or dump cans of paint and dust across huge canvases laid out on the floor, we begin to realize that something strange is happening, indeed has already happened, to the ontological status of the Western artist. He is no longer, that is to say, a creator of forms, but rather an unmaker of them, a builder not of cosmologies, but rather a chronicler of their decimation. This is a complete overturning of the traditional role of the artist, who was always, in the ancient world, the great man who became deified as the result of creating radically new technological breakthroughs. Daedalus was the larger-than-life engineer who invented the possibility of flight. Prometheus domesticated fire. Cain built the first cities. Vulcan made the various tools and implements with which the gods of Mount Olympus adorned themselves. The medieval artist, furthermore, as we have seen, was always a cosmocrator, imitating in miniature Yahweh's feats of designing the cosmos like a draftsman. Indeed, the artist clear down to the modernists was a builder of worlds. But Kiefer's installation at La Rebote is no longer tantamount to the construction of a world, but is rather an apotheosis of a three-dimensional midden heap composed out of the shattered forms and discarded signifiers that, once upon a time, served as the building blocks for the construction of the metaphysical age. The midden heap, as Marshall McLuhan was fond of pointing out, is what results from the technological innovations that come along to construct new environments and cosmologies, but in the process simultaneously scrap the previous environment into a junk heap. Here, the previous environment of the industrial city is retrieved and scaled down to become a work of art in the new environment of the digital age that has rendered it superfluous. It was Plato, as McLuhan points out, who created the first midden heap by junking the world of becoming and tossing it into his cave as a disused artifact, together with the entire Paleolithic tribal world of shadow forms on the walls. The Hebrews of the Old Testament, nearly simultaneously, both Jews and Greeks, are the inceptual founders of the metaphysical age, scrapped the technologies of the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians in the Old Testament, for just as the alphabet junked Egyptian hieroglyphs, when Moses comes down the mountain, he orders the shattering of the iconic golden calf, so too the Mesopotamian ziggurat was delegitimized precisely through the process of caricaturizing it as the Tower of Babel. The Christians too tossed the entire pagan world onto the scrap heap during the 4th century AD when, under the edicts of the Emperor Theodosius, the cessation of the pagan holidays, the stopping of the Olympic Games, and the closing of the Temple of the Vestal Virgins took place. The Christians, meanwhile, elevated the Codex as the new technology of the book that tossed both the Jewish as well as the Greek scrolls onto the junk heap. But it was the Renaissance humanists who began to retrieve from the scrap heap the basic archetypal forms which they used to construct their new age. The Laocoon was dug up in 1506 and became the great influence on Michelangelo's later works, just as Botticelli, Titian, and the other great artists began to retrieve humanistic themes to become the building blocks for the age of the world picture. The Renaissance was an essentially negentropic undertaking in which the rubbish heap bequeathed to Europe by antiquity was for the first time raided and pillaged for ideas and works of art to be used as constitutive features for a new civilization. Carl Jung, too, created a midden heap out of the desacralized gods of antiquity when he placed all the world's great religious forms into the debris pile of his collective unconscious, from whence literary theoreticians like Joseph Campbell and Erich Neumann retrieved the gods to be used under the ontologically reduced status of mere symbols and metaphors. And as we have seen, the great artists of modernism, such as Marc Chagall and Paul Klee, retrieved these archetypal forms to become the structuring iconotypes of modernist art. Even a work like Derrida's of grammatology is essentially one vast reduction of the great texts of the metaphysical age to a single midden heap. Derrida, in deconstructing all the great metaphysical systems, essentially tosses them into his textual junkyard of deconstructed signifieds. Once the transcendental signifieds are out of the way, they free up for him the endless différance of the play of signification in which meaning can be deferred to infinity. But now note that it is not traditionally the artist, but rather the thinker who reduces previous world ages to midden heaps. Plato, the Hebrew prophets, the Christian church fathers, Jung and Derrida are all thinkers, not artists. Thinkers, moreover, who at a stroke reduce previous world ages to piles of debris and discarded signifiers. The artist, on the other hand, is the one who, like Daedalus or Prometheus, initiates new technologies and creates new worlds by building forms up, or else retrieving older forms from previous midden heaps generated by the entropic processes of cultural evolution. With the art of Anselm Kiefer at Labre Boat, however, it is clear that the traditional semiotics of these processes have now been turned upside down. In scene after scene of Sophie Fiennes' film, we witness Kiefer breaking forms down, melting them into slag heaps and reducing them to piles of rubble. The contemporary artist is a cosmocrator no longer, but a builder of junk heaps. The central concern of Kiefer's art has shifted from that of the future to the past, from the construction of cosmologies to an interest in the entropic processes generated by the dissipative structures of such cosmologies. Kiefer's work is a monument to the discarded forms and deconstructed meta-narratives of the metaphysical age. As the eye roams across Labre Boat, it discovers abandoned and broken signifiers everywhere. A painting full of U-boats, a technology that once functioned as an extension of the forces of destruction that led to the apocalypse of World War II, or his sculpted texts that look as if they had survived the burning down of some vast library, lining the shelves of crumbling archives surrounded by broken glass. The great textual narratives that once functioned as the warp and the weft of the construction of ideas in the metaphysical age are here reduced to a slag heap. Just as for Gadamer and his truth and method, the text, as opposed to the work of art, which for Gadamer gains being, actually suffers a reduction in ontological status as it loses being. For Gadamer, the text can never be objectively reconstructed. It is always only a product of the biases and prejudices of its age, and so it recedes and diminishes its ontological status nearly to zero. The texts that once built Western civilization are no longer, for either Kiefer or Gadamer, grand transcendental signifieds functioning as orienting constellations in the night sky of the Western imagination, but rather burned, shriveled, ragged, and ashy forms that look as though they had survived an apocalypse and are about as useful. The huge canvases upon which Kiefer and his assistant are shown in the film gluing oversized teeth into a cracked and parched earth are, of course, Cadmus's dragon's teeth as symbols of the alphabet, those linealized units of pars pro toto that carved up the two-dimensional images of the mythical age and reduced them to one-dimensional lines of text on the printed page. The teeth are the alphabet, which Cadmus was said to have imported to Greece from Phoenicia, and they are the seeds of abstract visual linearity, from out of which the text as Christian codex grew, the very texts at the dawn of the metaphysical age that anathematized the pagan deities. In another scene, we see these teeth strewn randomly across stacks of large, oversized, sculpted books, as the very seeds of the Western tradition from out of which the books as flowers took form. Kiefer's Towers of Babel, that he has constructed out of a series of slabs of concrete and erected upon platforms containing his sculpted, processed, and acidified books, are the delegitimized ziggurats of the Old Testament. The towers, in other words, are growing out of the books as their foundations, for indeed the Tower of Babel was constructed out of the teeth of the Hebrew alphabet, which they used, like chips broken from the jaw of Moses, to deauthorize the technologies of the entire first generation of human civilization in Mesopotamia. The biblical image of the Tower of Babel is a vision of the collapse of an entire plane of organization, together with all its various strata, star gods above, infernal gods below, human cities in between, into one vast desert plain of roving Bedouins and limestone cliffs where lizards dart across rocks. Everywhere at Labre Boat we find the ruins of the metaphysical age, paintings with maps of constellations, those patterns that once organized and built entire civilizations in the ancient Near East, melted slag heaps of liquid metal processed over mounds of dirt, abandoned rooms littered with brittle stacks of discarded palm fronds, the palm of Palm Sunday that Christ took with him on the ride into Jerusalem, and a whole underground labyrinth of tunnels full of broken pottery vessels and fallen meteorites as artifacts of the Neolithic, pottery made from earthly clay, just as the meteorites became the foundation for the great megalith cults of Cybele and the Kaaba. Labre Boat is a veritable Foucauldian heterotopia, a space of otherness in which we are witness to the collapse of the West's entire plane of organization, once organized arborescently into linear tiers and strata erected all the way to the heavens. But in the post-metaphysical age, this plane of organization, like the Old Testament Tower of Babel, has collapsed, stratum on top of stratum, into a vast plane of consistency littered with destratified forms and crushed signifiers. This is not an art that is pregnant with the future, but an art that is entirely directed back toward the past, a cross-sectional analysis of the collapse of the entire skeleton of the Western mind. vertebra imploded into vertebra pulled down by its own gravitational inertia. The artist of such a heterotopia is a fashioner of ruins who reveals to us what has become of the metaphysical age. He is no longer, however, in process on the way to a discovery of new forms, as was initiated during the Carolingian era, when the Irish monks imported into the court at Aix-la-Chapelle began the process of sifting out signifiers from the midden heap of antiquity. Greek, Latin, and Hebrew as languages dusted off from the scrap pile to begin the cult of historical scholarship that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. But Kiefer's midden heap is a vision of the omega point of Western history as a collapsed, rusted, and broken edifice like one of those shattered cathedrals in a Caspar David Friedrich painting. It is indeed an art that comes after Auschwitz, for the metaphysical certainties of that age, racial degeneracy, ethnic cleansing, Indo-Aryanism, made the camps possible in the first place, and these grim articulations of the Western mind were unfolded and illuminated to men's minds from out of the pages of the metaphysically certain printed book. Thus, the very books that began European history at one end, with their revelations of the three ages of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, eventually culminate via the back alleys of philology into the climax of history as a Third Reich with various final solutions applied towards the management of its end. Indeed, the bombings of cities from the air, Dresden and Hamburg, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were extreme events that ultimately were made possible by the pages of books. Hence, the landscape at La Rabote is littered with the shattered and blackened shells of their remains. The metaphysically certain book can be trusted no longer, for we have seen what sorts of atrocities it can lead to. But then the film's final closing image of those haunting, slender towers of Babel, inhabited by the ghost of Lilith, might also be read as vectors pointing into the future. For someday some band of wandering nomads might stumble upon the ruins of our western metropolises, and they may indeed resemble nothing so much as a skyline of abandoned and multiplicitous towers of Babel, towering over the wreck of a once mighty civilization sunken into the cracked red earth and covered with dust and wind-blown detritus. It is perhaps an art of the future after all.